This is my 1990 Pontiac Grand Am SE. I bought this car solely because of the wheels. I mean, come on, some of the raddest wheels to come out of the 80s and 90s. But I own way too many cars, so this Grand Am is now up for sale. Today, let's take an in-depth look at this once ubiquitous economy car before it heads off to the new owner. If you've seen some of my recent videos, you're likely aware that I have far too many cars, most of them old, needy vehicles. And they're more or less driving me insane. So I'm in the process of slimming down my collection, driving less, and trying to close this car hoarding chapter of my life. Like I mentioned at the top of this video, I literally bought this Pontiac because of these rad wheels. I know it's a terrible idea to buy a vehicle because of wheels. I never said I was smart, but to be fair, I also bought this Grand Am because the nostalgia center of my brain is a masochist. Just one more old car, it said, and I listened. But the nostalgia with this one is very strong. These third-gen Grand Ams were everywhere when I was a kid. Driving around in it immediately takes me back to the 90s. Reminds me of the type of car my grandma would have owned to drive us around in. But now these cars are nearly all gone. Where did they all go? And were these third-gen Grand Ams actually decent cars? Or are we better off looking at these old end bodies with a nice pair of rose-colored glasses? My favorite places to drive are areas where nobody else is around. So let's get out of the city and talk about this once ubiquitous and forgotten Pontiac. Before we take a look at my Grand Am, let's go back in time for a little Grand Am history lesson.
If you can stand it this hot, we've got a bowl of red with your name on it. Grand Am. Pontiac Grand Am.
Back in the 70s, Pontiac created a new car model that attempted to merge the sportiness of Trans Am and the luxury of the Grand Prix. They called it the Grand Am. The first two generations never really sold all that well. The first was introduced right before the fuel crisis in the 70s, and its thirsty V8s didn't help sales. The second gen shared a platform with like 1,000 other GM cars, so it never really stood out, and it was killed after a couple years. GM went back to the drawing board with this smaller and more efficient third gen, which replaced the mostly unpopular Pontiac Phoenix. The Phoenix was essentially a rebadged Chevy Citation. The Citation initially sold really well, but sales dropped off a cliff after news of quality issues became known. So to try to help consumers forget about the Citation and the Phoenix, the new 485 front-wheel drive N-body was introduced. The Grand Am was GM's, quote, sportiest option for this platform. Early cars had a couple 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder options, and in '86 we got composite headlights with the SE model. In '89 we got new front and rear fascias, and in 1990 the HO version of the Quad 4 could be had on the Grand Am SE when you got it with a manual, making 180 horsepower. Pretty insane for a 4-cylinder of the era. It took a couple years after introduction, but eventually Pontiac had a hit on their hands. GM built nearly 3 million of them during its 7-year run. The fourth gen was more rounded and featured even more body cladding and continued with strong sales. The fifth and final gen had even more cladding, at least in the early years, and ran until 2005 until it was replaced by the Pontiac G6. But let's skip back to the third gen, which is what I have here. Let's do a little walk around of this now forgotten, sporty compact car. Out here in the front, you've got the iconic Pontiac split grille. Who do you think did the split grille better, BMW or Pontiac? I actually think Pontiac did it better, but I'm probably the only person on the planet that thinks that. Anyway, down here you've got fog lights, proving that this is an extra sporty vehicle. Nice air dam down here, very plastic and very flimsy, but you know, it's the 90s. Pontiac badge is actually contained within a circle up here in the front. So moving on to the side, obviously I have the 2-door model, but a 4-door was also available. I happen to think that the 2-door is the sportier one. And check out these rad wheels. I love them. I believe these were also found on some other Pontiacs. I think maybe the Transport van. And check this out right here, 16 valve badge. Back in the 80s and 90s, car manufacturers loved to provide you with information about what's going on inside the vehicle. Oh, but it does say fuel injection. So we do have 2 features advertised on the outside of this vehicle. Color matched Grand Am badge right here. Very, very nice. Now, when this design first came out when I was a kid, I didn't really think it was anything all that special, but it's really kind of aged pretty well. Right back here, you have a very abrupt angle for the rear window, which looks a little funny, but it provides insanely good rear seat headroom. Legroom, that's another story, but we'll get to that. And of course, you've got several metric tons of body cladding, which again, I didn't like it at the time, but nostalgia, the feels, I kind of love it now. Out here in the back, you've got these incredibly rad taillights with this cool grid design. Again, color match badging, and you've got 2 cutouts for exhaust, although there's only one little tiny lonesome exhaust pipe right here that is completely empty on this side. So sad. The first thing you'll notice upon stepping into this later 3rd gen Grand Am is how simple it is. This was a relatively inexpensive compact car from the era. It wasn't the cheapest Pontiac of 1990. You could also have the Daewoo built Le Mans or the J-body Sunbird. It is pretty small by today's standards, but it was right in the middle of Pontiac's car lineup, below the 6000, the Grand Prix, and the Bonneville. So the dashboard design, yes, it's very simple. And don't get too close to the dashboard materials. They might break if you look at them funny. Definitely some brittle plastics here, lots of squeaks, lots of rattles, but it was pretty common for GM of this era. But there's something weird here that I'm wondering if you can figure out. Stare at this for a moment. Is there anything here that strikes you as weird? I'll give you some time. It's off center. The gauges and the dashboard and the steering wheel, they're not centered, they're not aligned. It doesn't seem immediately apparent that there's a reason for it to be this way. Were the engineers off by a ½ an inch and the notoriously stingy GM bean counters said, good enough? I don't get it. I'm not really sure what's going on here. I mean, maybe it has something to do with making this dash reversible for other markets, so you can put the steering wheel over there. I'm not really sure. I have a feeling that it probably has something to do with GM cheaping out somewhere. You'll notice that this steering wheel is actually relatively simple for Pontiac standards of the era. The higher end Pontiacs got a lot more buttons. We just have horn buttons here. Kind of sad. I miss all those buttons from my Grand Prix. The switchgear is pretty simple. You got these cool little buttons on either side for the lights and the wipers. Check out this kind of unique double slide section in the middle here. Slide this one down and you have an ashtray. Slide this one and now you have a cup holder. That's pretty ingenious. I mean, the cup holder is mostly useless, but it's pretty neat. Window switches are right below that. Perfect place to spill your soda or coffee directly on the switches. Leather wrapped shift knob. Only the sportiest features in this Grand Am SE. I really like the design of this panel here. It's got these little tiny squares. It looks pretty neat. I actually have a auto reverse tape player, which is really quite fancy for the era. And right here, I love this. Super, super simple controls for the AC and the heat. You don't even have to take your eyes off the road. A quad vent right here in the middle. I'm not sure why they went so crazy with this with all these dials. Feels like they could have got away with maybe half the amount. But yeah, it looks cool. The seats are not very comfortable, but the material looks like it would survive a nuclear blast. This material looks incredibly durable. And of course, you've got this passive restraint system. It's kind of annoying, and I can't imagine they do a whole lot in the case of a bad wreck. If the door opens during a crash, you're just gonna fall right out of the car. The back seat's pretty small. I don't really feel like going back there. But we need to answer the question, was this car any good? By today's standards, this thing is simple, it's straightforward, it's pretty reliable, and it's even kind of fun to drive. This quad-4 engine is quite powerful. The car does seem pretty, quote, peppy, even when compared to modern compact cars. And this isn't even the high output version. The 4-speed automatic transmission does its job, it's perfectly adequate, though the quad-4 isn't exactly known for being a refined engine. Even with the fresh motor mounts,
the vibration it sends through the steering wheel might make you think there's a crew of elves under the hood jackhammering the steering column. And the engine kind of sounds like an unhappy lawnmower at full throttle. But that's just the way these were, and you get used to it. To be fair, most economy cars of the era didn't exactly sound refined. The build quality wasn't quite up to the standards of the Japanese offerings at the time, but these cars were pretty reliable and extremely durable. I knew someone in college that had one of these and accidentally ran it without oil for months. It just never gave up. In the 80s and 90s, GM was pretty good at making cars that could withstand neglect, deferred maintenance, and abuse. And with this SE model, or the Sporting Edition, Pontiac did try to inject some fun into it, with the more powerful engine, the super rad wheels. But let's not talk about handling. Driving on a curvy road like this sort of makes it feel like you're driving on a road that's made out of Jell-O. The commercials for this car touted its sportiness and excitement, but if you really wanted a car that handled decently, you probably would have been better off with something like a Nissan Sentra SER, which came in at around the same price. It didn't have nearly as much power though. Even though excitement was Pontiac's brand, I doubt many Grand Ams were sold to driving enthusiasts. They were sold to customers that really liked the styling, they liked the features, and they really liked the powerful engine. And it was a pretty decent value too. One of the things that I appreciate about this third gen Grand Am is that it's so small. Yeah, maybe not by 1990 standards, but very small by today's standards. Cars have gotten so much bigger in the last 30 years. It's refreshing to drive a car that is actually a more sensible size. These were family cars back in the day. Yes, even with 2 doors. 3 decades later, and people have gotten greedy. People have gotten entitled. A lot of people buy way more car than what they would actually use on a regular basis.
Oh, I need a 9-seat Suburban for my 2 kids because sometimes we go on vacations. Oh, and I need 29 cup holders because sometimes Madison and Braden are thirsty. Oh, and I need an SUV to be able to tow my 15,000-pound trailer with my boat on it to the lake because we go there like once a year. Oh, and it needs to have leather seats because I deserve it. Oh, and it needs to be 9 feet tall so I can see over all of these other idiots on the road.
Okay, I'm sure you get it. I appreciate these smaller, simpler cars from this era. And there really is something great about these less complicated, honest, compact cars from the 80s and 90s. And it's fun driving something that was once everywhere and now is completely forgotten. Stepping inside this car is like stepping into a time machine. It immediately transports you back to 1990, and everyone outside is standing there, scratching their heads, wondering what the heck they're looking at. It's so familiar, but most people haven't seen one of these in ages. It was such a popular car, and now they're all gone. So here we are, over 3 decades since this car was built. 3 million of these things once roamed streets and strip mall parking lots all over North America. Even into the early 2000s, you would still see third gen Grand Ams out and about. But then one day, they pretty much all disappeared. A quick nationwide search of Craigslist turned up 0 third gen Grand Ams for sale. I'm sure there's still some in use and maybe some sitting in garages or rotting away in fields across the US, but I have to imagine most of those 3 million Grand Ams have likely been crushed and turned into washing machines or refrigerators by now. They were generally treated as disposable appliances. Because these were common everyday cars, commuter cars, they were never worth much, and they got sent to the crusher when repair bills got too expensive. But that's why I was drawn to it. I like the idea of saving these unappreciated vehicles, cars that were just used as basic transportation. So, how do I wrap up my ownership experience with this Grand Am? To be honest, as a car, intrinsically, it's not all that remarkable. Well, except for the wheels. But owning this car has been fantastic. What it lacks in refinement and build quality, it makes up for in style, and in charm, and in honesty. Driving a 3rd gen Grand Am over 30 years after it was built truly transports you right back to a time when cars were a bit simpler, a bit smaller. People all over used cars just like this one to cart their families around. This SE right here may be one of the last ones left. If you know of a 3rd gen Grand Am that's still on the road, post up in the comments. And if you want to buy this one, let me know. If you've seen some of my recent videos, you're probably aware that my perspective on cars and making videos with cars has shifted a bit. I'm in the process of selling off most of my collection because car hoarding, as it turns out, is bad actually, but I'll still likely have a weird old car here and there. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider buying a Hello Road t-shirt or support me on Patreon. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're well, and I'll see you soon.
Oh, yeah.